I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing for a number of years, and it's all about Agile. I'll explain a little bit why that's the kind of centerpiece of what I want to talk about in a second. And I'll just start by saying that this is my own research, and the opinions and ideas expressed in it are independent of my work and studies. So just to disclaim anything there. So where did I get interested in Agile, and why is it of any relevance to design and economics? Well, I started being interested in software development because as a practitioner and as a researcher, I work with designers who are in some form or another working in software development in its broadest sense, so creating digital products and services. And digital products and services are, for me, a sizable area of employment for designers, and a sizable area of what people talk about, the digital economy, or to use the neoliberalist term from where it came from, the new economy, going back to 2001. Despite the number and impact of design within that part of the economy, I see it as relatively under-researched in two specific ways, in terms of the contribution and kind of size of that area of employment, and its contribution as a specific area of design. But also as a topic of understanding what designers do. So, there is a lot of research on design practice, but it tends to be disconnected from the real world of what most design students go into and what they experience. So that's kind of where I started from. And I looked at Agile, which is obviously primarily in terms of research in the software engineering, computer science side of things, and found that there are a kind of number of narratives that underpin what Agile is. And the first one is I'm going to call it a kind of mythology around it, really, but early software development. And basically the idea that traditional ways of working and scientific management processes and approaches failed to deliver software. And this was quite a significant turning point in how technology was developed, even by its own advocates. So the first software engineering conference in 1968 was run by NATO, had lots of scientists and engineers, and even they realized that there was something wrong with kind of scientific engineering paradigm to develop software for some reason. And the reason I mention that is because Agile was seen as being the silver bullet, as they were looking for, to early software development. The second kind of mythology around Agile is that the nature of digital products and services are such a paradigm shift from traditional materials, which means that they need to be looked at and conceived, even in terms of economics, in a different way. And you can see that in the service design literature through service dominant logic and the move from goods to services. And really, Agile is just a kind of reflection of that. That's, we're not manufacturing cars and chairs from solid materials, but we're creating things that are continually being changed and iterated, and also that changes the way that products and services are made, because they're not being stamped out by machines, they're being created by information workers. And to bring it back to design, designers are part of that kind of workforce that makes them. So I just wanted to say where the kind of interest in Agile came from. And there's those two kind of narratives around it. And to me, they are self-justifying stories about why Agile has become so important. And I see that it's not just a technique for making stuff, that it's actually something much more significant. And this is why I see Agile as the embodiment of neoliberalist ideas in the area of means of production. So, you know, if you look at kind of work studies and how the means of production and distribution and exchange have evolved over a number of years, moving from kind of artisanal production to factories, created a division of labour. They created the need for physical workspaces. The division of labour then had certain consequences in terms of needing support services around that and an educated workforce. And I think that Agile is of a similar level of magnitude in terms of its impact on society. So I'm just going to pause there for a second. Hold on. Is there any questions while I just want to check back on something?
No. At this point, we had a talk actually quite near the beginning, which was about it was sort of discussion around Agile a little bit, because we had a couple of people from the UK government sort of talking about working in Agile teams, and it was just the beginning of a little conversation really, and there was just some sort of thoughts around how you understand the economy within Agile working, in the sense of how you make decisions about what's done. They were talking specifically about things like technical debt, but other forms of debt within the kind of Agile economy. So just not really a question, but it's nice to sort of think about how these themes might link up as well. So it's nice to look at how those themes are emerging, but definitely, obviously keen to see the rest of, what you're talking about.
Cool. So yeah, I just kind of realised I've kind of got some different slides that kind of saying the same thing, which I'm going to switch to now. So as I mentioned, looking at the connection between neoliberalism and Agile, and also mentioned that I've already published in this area. So these papers are all open access, so you can see those. And then I was just talking about how these kind of narratives and myths around Agile have kind of evolved. I really got into this and kind of looked at the idea of product as being different in a digital perspective, but also this way of working that is about continually changing and improving and refining products in a kind of live environment that you get that you can do in software development. And if you want to really take it further, you can kind of reverse engineer a theory of Agile, because if Agile is about something that's completely mutable and continually changing, that changes how we understand what a product is and a physical thing is. It also changes what design is, because design is not a kind of activity about planning what something is in the future and kind of blueprinting it. It's rather design is part of that producing of stuff. And it's also something that's distributed rather than perhaps more traditional ways of looking at design. So that's in one of the papers, but if you want to kind of see how far you can take Agile as a kind of idea, that's one of them. And for me, the idea that you're producing these products and services that are continually changing is a starting point for looking at how designers work and how design works fits into the kind of neoliberalist agenda. When I looked, and it's interesting you mentioned waste, Simon, because when I done primary research around this, and I looked at developers and designers and sponsors in terms of their experiences of working in Agile, and perhaps surprisingly, the experience of designers was good and bad. And the first point in terms of the positive experiences of working in that environment is the sense of agency. And again, agency in a distributed sense, so that both from a kind of personal perspective, people really, like working collaboratively, but it's not just a social value. It's also because they're learning and they're building agency within a group of people. Then we get into kind of the three core values of agile development for stakeholders and sponsors. And that's the notion that people are working towards a mission. A mission is something that is not as flexible as a project, but it has value to it. And it kind of has that sense that there is pace and speed of delivering value. And those three things, again, have both positive and negative impacts on designers. So sometimes missions conflict with designers' personal values. Sometimes they see themselves as being asked to do stuff that they're not entirely comfortable with. Sometimes they are being asked to do things that are unachievable. But on the positive side, having a kind of goal that can be achieved with a group of people is enjoyable. Similarly, pace, pace can be positive in terms of moving to different missions, but it also can create stress. And some of the research I've done with designers has kind of highlighted where the pace is too much for people, and also the sequencing of different disciplines within teams is not quite right. So again, you get this sense of waste, and waste in the research that I've done is both wasted value, which can be where because missions are looking at incremental value, they can often miss kind of more strategic levels of impact. And similarly, there's a human aspect to waste where there are gaps between passing work between different people. There is waste because the work is low value. So those are the kind of felt experience of Agile from designers and pretty much the same for developers. So kind of a bit of a mixed bag there.
Can I just sort of just say, add in as well here, we're talking particularly about the pace part. Because I teach a master's course in primarily service design. So some of the students who come into that from work have worked in Agile environments. And it was quite interesting, at least one or two of the students, because I wanted to talk about it as part of service design, because there's such an intersection in how it's being done and all this kind of thing. But some of those students were really sick of working in Agile environments.
Yeah.
They for various reasons, kind of the pace, the inability to actually do design in the sense that maybe they would want to do design. So all of those things I think are really interesting. And so just one other thing is a book that I don't claim to have finished reading, but there's a book called, you probably know it, Principles of Product Development Flow, by Donald Rhineston. I can't pronounce his surname, to be honest with you. Which is all about sort of the lean kind of, adapting the lean principles into kind of this sort of small batch development process. And his first kind of opening bit is all about economics. So It's quite interesting in thinking about that. I kind of thought about that a couple of times over this unconference as well. But the question is also, what do we mean by economics in this context? Because like you're talking about, a lot of these things are about producing. They're producing for a certain set of stakeholders and sponsors who want to have something that they need because they need to sell it. So there's that kind of economy. But of course, the wider sense of the economy and who it benefits is an interesting one in regard to, how Agile works and what people are working for in terms of the short-term versus long-term thing you were talking about as well. So it's just an interesting topic.
So one of the papers that I talked about and something I'm working on at the moment explores the kind of felt experience of designers in Agile in much more depth. So as well as the kind of there's one phrase that someone used in the research, feeding the agile monster. So it's that kind of sense of unrelentingness, but also, as you mentioned, and maybe this is kind of touching on some of these things, is designers' sense of marginalization in those kind of development teams, and that the role of design is often seen as a kind of production role of creating assets. So yeah, it's kind of this low production value of what designers do compared to the more strategic stuff. So that's a kind of common, I guess, aspect of this. In terms of that, the value thing, and the different ways that we see design value, both in terms of the output of the product or service, and the kind of sponsorship. The distinctive thing for me, and just to go back, is that designers in these kind of areas of work are part of the means of production. They're producing the product and the service, because it's digital, and the stuff that they do and the stuff that they create is part of the code. It's part of the DNA of the product, and I think that's substantially different from the roles that designers had with physical products, where they're unless they're kind of makers or artisanal designers, they are separated to some level from the means of production. So just to kind of go back a little bit in terms of, well, you know, yeah, Agile is kind of how a lot of products and services are developed. It has this kind of resonance with kind of entrepreneurial culture and lean, as you mentioned, Simon. And that's kind of interesting. But what has that got to do with neoliberalism and economics? Well, apart from that being the primary means of developing a sizable part of the stuff that people buy and use, I argue that there is something deeper, and it goes back to the kind of myths and narratives around why Agile became itself, which is about how it embodies a set of ideas, but also a set of behaviors and practices that map pretty precisely to a kind of neoliberalist worldview. And that worldview is where you have precarious labor, people are working in different teams, moving around. They embody this kind of technology worldview where technology and science are the solutions to things, the kind of common sense way of looking at the world. But I think most importantly, they reinforce and help to embody the idea that the role of designers is to be part of the means of production, to produce stuff that is of value, rather than being outside of that. And the interesting thing for Agile, and you know, when the Agile manifesto came out, one of the things around that was very clear that this was a change in how people worked, and a change from hierarchical management and scientific management, all these things that had failed in the old way of doing software engineering, to something that is much more empowered. And I say empowered because to me, the second kind of paradigm shifting topics with Agile is the idea that people are self-governing and self-managing, and have embodied all of the principles and ideas of management within themselves, what they do, and those around them. And one of the key kind of manifestations of Scrum is the various rituals, and underpinning those, I think, things like points poker is the idea that work and what people do can be reduced into numbers. So the kind of well-known focus on quantifying labor in Agile is kind of pervasive, because it goes through estimation, how long things will take, the importance, the priority. So designers' role is no longer a qualitative one, it's a quantitative one, and that's kind of reinforced through the rituals that they do in their day-to-day work. So hence we have the idea of embodied Agile, and there's a couple of really good, literally a couple of good papers that start to touch on that, which are in my papers that are open access. And one of those talks about how Foucault's idea of embodiment and governance, so how things are structured in terms of structure and agency in social practice, not because people are told to do something, but because they embody a certain set of ideas and behaviors. And you can see we have the successful embodied Agile person and the unfortunate person who's on the waterfall side of things. So again, just trying to bring this back to not just economics, because I think it's pretty common sense that the way that designers are integrated into the means of production means that they are part of the broader economy, and not just in the wider kind of economies of design perspective of a kind of global area of value production and distribution, but that they're actually part of the means of production. But there's one last connection between neoliberalism in particular and Agile, and it's something that kind of unlocks the way that both of those manifest themselves, and it's the idea of exigency, which is continually crisis solving and continually being restless in moving around, rather than the more kind of Newtonian world where things are solid and stable. So apart from the kind of purely economic sense that agile work is part of the economy, there is this kind of underlying restlessness, I think, that links the two.
And I just kind of picks up on that, and also the just another, well, I remember it. There was I watched some of because I follow some Agile people on Twitter, particularly some of those who are kind of sort of detractors, or at least trying to push against some of the things you're talking about. So kind of the couple of movements that I've seen, sort of things like sort of no estimates movement, and people who are kind of moving away from things like story points and the kind of quantitative stuff that you're talking about, which I find quite interesting. But a small niche one that I found as well a little while ago was this idea of kind of slow agile, which I quite like, which is about, really trying to slow down the pace and trying to remove that kind of pace and moving around of the whole thing. But it seems to be, to me, that it's sort of pulling at something rather than kind of looking at the whole thing and really sort of challenging that. It's kind of picking at some of these aspects, but not necessarily challenging the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's so many interesting kind of differences and contradictions almost in Agile. So on the one hand, it was kind of seen as being a break with hierarchical ways of managing people and empowering them. But then at the same time, it's kind of more intensive, another neoliberalism way of kind of working, because it's more intensified, because people are not being kind of told what to do. They're actually kind of almost doing and telling what needs to be done themselves, in a much more intensified way. But as you say, you also get this kind of tension between people feeling that they are empowered because Agile it only works through collaboration, and collaboration only works because people need to be actively involved in and shape it and change it, but at the same time seeing it as being quite a negative experience themselves. So there is like some real tensions. I'd say generally that the the people who shape and comment on this tend to be more on the development side than designers side.
Yeah.
Generally, designers feel disempowered, and also this kind of real sense that Agile is a technology thing. It's a software thing. It's not a design thing. So almost kind of the values and culture of that kind of way of working is almost kind of stigmatizing and putting them off. And then another contradiction is, even though that's the case, and like when Agile is working effectively, is I think when it's more development than design and development. Designers are also kind of seen to have all of these really important elements and aspects of what they do. And one of them, interestingly, is about kind of humanizing technology. And both, so in some of the research that I did with designers and developers, both designers and developers think that designers are the people who are basically kind of safeguarding everything and making sure that, you know, we're not going to become robots or, you know, put out of jobs and solve all of these ethical problems that are far beyond the kind of very production level work that designers are actually doing. So yeah, there's all these contradictions with it, and how it kind of plays out in the end, I'm not really sure. But I think generally it's the developers who, and I see that also as an economic thing, because developers are much closer to the actual production of stuff, that designers are slightly backward from that. And I think that gives them status and power in that relationship.
Just say another thing that I saw a while ago is when you know, Agile really kind of moved into the sort of service design space, when there was much more of a connection between Agile and service design. People were obviously rethinking how Agile teams were built or put together. And one of the big changes that happened, well, I mean, a change that happened at the time was obviously embedding user researchers into Agile teams. And it's quite interesting because on the face of it, that seems like a good idea, you know, because obviously it means that you've got the heart of why you're designing theoretically within the team that you're doing. But in a way, it's almost a kind of short-circuiting of the design process, where you're effectively kind of just trying to work out exactly what it is that somebody wants and then build it, you know, rather than actually what are the wider implications of what we're doing, or some of these things that you were just talking about that designers are being given responsibility for, like the ethical side, you know, the kind of longer term view, all these kind of things. It's a sort of short-circuiting of that development process, even if it seems on the face of it to be how you become human-centered, you know. So it's a tension as well. I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that is, yeah, I've seen that. So it's almost like, yeah, if we kind of got researchers and designers, then we're kind of doing it, but we're not really doing it. We're just kind of, yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for bearing with me on that.
It's really interesting. Sorry, Isaac, did you have anything else that you wanted to add or say?
No, I was thinking about this a lot because I have friends who work with Agile, and I know they complain about all these backlogs and sprints that they have to do, and that how they feel that they are doing something, but they are replaceable. So it's not that they are owning anything. And you were talking about empowerment, and I took a note on that, about how the Agile process should be about empowering the people participating. But for designers, it's more about just creating the means for them to be replaceable in the process. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, so there's a real strong sense of disempowerment and marginalization for designers, and you know, interesting as well to kind of think about neoliberalism again in terms of job restructuring. You know, because essentially the role that designers have is kind of diminished because they're creating assets rather than you know, kind of doing more strategic stuff. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So I've been doing this research for a number of years. No one is particularly interested in it. I'm going to continue doing it because I think it's really important. And I'm only saying that just not to. I'm only saying that because I'm kind of a little bit surprised really with the design community in the lack of understanding and interest to see how designers, the real work of designers as a serious area of topic, as a serious area of research. Because for me, you know, if we're teaching designers to do a job and to spend their lives designing, as educators and practitioners, we should, I think, be kind of cognizant of the kind of environment and the problems that designers face. And I'd say generally, no one's particularly interested in that, which is kind of interesting. So well, it's great to share that with the two of you. And
I'm interested. I'm interested. Yeah, I'm interested. And actually, I think this is all on a continuum for the stuff that we've been talking about, because, you know, we've been talking a lot about sort of political economy of design. And, you know, early on in the unconference, we were talking about, you know, micro, macro as in the economic concepts, and how does this apply in design work? And for me, I feel this is exactly in that sort of spectrum, because as well as thinking about the macro environment that the designers are working in, you know, what are the politics at the time? What is the overwhelming kind of ideology that designers are working with? This also applies on a micro level. You know, Agile is very much that micro level, isn't it? You know, the small team with its own ethos, with its own ideology, is another kind of economic environment in which designers are working. So I feel like challenging this whole spectrum from micro to macro, you know, not just the two things, but this whole spectrum about the environments that designers are working in is really fundamentally important for understanding the future of design and how it can be better, and therefore the outcomes of design are better. So I think it's really important conversation, and, you know, we'll share this obviously throughout all of our channels. Now we've got a recording of it, which is brilliant. So, yeah, I am interested. Thank you.
But thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I'll just say, sorry, just one thing. It's really important, and the interesting thing, you know, and it's all since. So I was kind of looking at this kind of agile thing before, you know, economies of design, and like you say, there's the micro and macro. But the interesting thing that what I've found since kind of looking at it from the kind of neoliberalist perspective is actually it cuts through as well. You know, you can pretty easily look at, you know, I mentioned about kind of intensifying work, breaking down global barriers, precarious nature of they all kind of tally through as well. Sorry, Isaac.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask if you have thought about how the Agile, I don't know, yeah, how these components of Agile have spilled in other areas through designers that go work in teams, for example, in software, and then they take this kind of embodied Agile being and take it to other kind of work that they do, for example, because I see it in people trying to do social work and bring in these ideas of how the teams are going to be and how they are going to work with a community, for example.
Well, yeah, I think I've got that. When I kind of done a big literature review of Agile when I started this, the interesting thing is just how pervasive it is. Not just in design, but, you know, accountants. You know, I mean schools. You know, I mean the whole thing. I mean, my kids do show and tells now. You know, I mean, it's you know, and I mean, show and tell is, you know, a presentation, it's a talk, but I think the specific way that that is constructed and the rituals around it and things like hackathons and the kind of entrepreneurial culture, they all kind of work to frame behavior and thinking. And I should end by saying that I don't think that it's all bad, you know. So there is a tendency because of the values of where this stuff has come from to that resonates in the kind of world we live in. But there is also a progressive side of this, which is around collaboration. And an awareness that actually technology has ethical issues, you know. So I mean, if you compare now to when you know, 10, 20 years ago, where it's just like, well, if you're doing software, it's brilliant, everything's gonna be great, you know. So it's I think what Simon mentioned in terms of these kind of contradictions, there's a kind of manipulation side of it, if you want to look at it like that, but there's also a kind of progressive side, which is that it brings people together. It gets them to experience the issues together, and that is breaking with much more rigid and hierarchical ways of people organising than before. So both from my findings, but from a kind of position, I've always kind of tried to maintain that balance, because I think you could quite easily kind of go into it's like it's quite a negative side of it, whereas I think it's more the application than the kind of underlying practice itself.
Okay, thank you. Well,
Thank
yeah,
you.
no, that was really interesting. Thank you for that. It was a really nice discussion to have around it as well. So, yeah, thank you.
And I would not because anyone reads them at all, but if you want to, there's a bit articulated slightly better than I can do on a Friday morning. Papers go into to more detail, and they're open access. The other really interesting thing is this whole idea of kind of Foucault and governance, and how other professions kind of create these kind of self-maintaining identities.